Imagine waking in a Viking fjord village as war horns cut through dawn. Fog hides enemy ships that are rowing towards your home. You run to the beacon, touch flame to tar-soaked wood. Smoke climbs, warning neighbors miles away. 2 hours later, raiders land, and every farmer grabs a shield in defense. The geography of Scandinavia meant that attackers could appear almost anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline. Deep fjords, island chains, and river valleys that cut far inland gave raiders dozens of different approach routes. During winter, ice closed smaller harbors and made land travel difficult. But when spring came and the ice melted, raiding season began. From April to October, coastal farmers had to live with the constant threat that enemy ships might appear on the horizon. The threats came from everywhere. Ambitious local chieftains raided neighbors to steal livestock and capture slaves. Danish kings fought border wars with Frankish rulers to the south. Slavic pirates from the east sent summer fleets against Danish islands. Norwegian or Danish exiles sometimes returned with foreign allies to burn down their enemies' settlements. Even inland river valleys in Sweden had to build defenses, because Viking longships could sail far up rivers that other ships could not navigate. The Vikings' solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Do not just build walls, build a system. They created what modern military planners would recognize as defense in depth, where multiple layers of protection force attackers to fight their way through obstacle after obstacle until they lose momentum and the defenders can counterattack. The first layer was offense. Viking warlords rarely drew a sharp line between defense and attack. If someone insulted your honor or took your people as slaves, you launched a counter raid to make sure they knew the consequences. Because longships could travel 150 kilometers in a day under oar and sail, Viking strategists figured that rapid retaliation was often more effective than waiting behind walls for the next attack. When larger threats appeared, coalitions of enemy ships that outnumbered local defenders, the Vikings fell back on their layered system. Offshore islands served as lookout posts where watchers could spot approaching fleets hours before they reached the mainland. Coastal barriers at narrow straits slowed enemy ships and forced them into killing zones where defenders could attack from shore. Fortified trading towns provided operational bases where supplies could be stored and reinforcements gathered. Finally, inland hill forts secured the agricultural heartland where crops and livestock could be protected during extended campaigns. The genius of this system was that it forced attackers to make hard choices. They could try to fight their way through every layer, which would cost time and men while giving defenders opportunities to gather reinforcements. Or they could try to bypass the fortifications, which meant leaving dangerous enemies behind them and operating in hostile territory without supply bases. The Vikings also understood how to use natural terrain to multiply their defensive advantages. Steep granite ridges, marshes, and underwater rocks already channeled ship routes into predictable paths. Adding wooden stakes driven into harbor bottoms or stone barriers built across narrow straits could turn these natural choke points into death traps at minimal cost. Archaeologists have found evidence of these underwater barriers all around Scandinavia, including a 290-meter-long oak stake barrier in southern Sweden that was built around 1050 AD to control a strategic shipping channel. The most impressive part of the Viking defense system was the royal ring forts, massive circular fortresses that represented medieval engineering at its finest. Between 970 and 980 AD, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark ordered the construction of at least 5 identical circular fortresses: Trelleborg, Agersborg, Fyrkat, Nonnebakken, and Borgring. These were not crude wooden stockades thrown up by desperate farmers. They were precision-engineered military installations that show the Vikings had access to advanced mathematics and construction techniques. All 5 ring forts share almost identical measurements. They range from 120 to 180 meters in diameter, with perfectly circular earthen ramparts topped by timber palisades. The interior is divided into 4 equal sections by roads that run straight to gates positioned at the exact cardinal directions. The geometric precision of these fortresses suggests that they were designed by skilled engineers using standardized plans, probably drawn up by the royal court and then distributed to construction crews across Denmark. The largest of these forts, Agersborg, has an interior diameter of 240 meters, large enough to house 48 longhouses that could accommodate about 5,000 fighting men. That is larger than many modern military bases. The fort guards the Limfjord, a shallow waterway that provided a shortcut between the North Sea and the Baltic. Any enemy fleet trying to use this route would have to sail directly under the walls of Agersborg, where thousands of Danish warriors could rain arrows and spears down on them. These ring forts were not just military installations, they were statements of royal power. Building them required enormous amounts of labor, timber, and iron that could only be organized by a strong central government. The identical design sent a clear message. King Harold Bluetooth controlled resources and manpower that could create identical fortresses hundreds of kilometers apart. It was like building 5 identical Pentagon buildings, just to show that you could do it. But the ring forts were only part of a much larger defensive system. The centerpiece was the Danevirke, a massive earthwork that stretched 30 kilometers across the narrow neck of the Jutland Peninsula. This was the Vikings' version of the Great Wall of China, except instead of keeping out nomadic horsemen, it was designed to stop Frankish armies from marching north into Denmark. The Danevirke combined ditches up to 6 meters deep with earthen ramparts topped by timber palisades. The first phase was built around 700 AD, but Harold Bluetooth expanded parts of it into stone-faced walls that stood several meters high. The earthwork linked the Schlei Inlet on the east coast to North Sea marshes on the west, creating a continuous barrier that forced any land-based invasion to attack through heavily fortified gates or try to march around through tidal swamps. The brilliant part of the Danevirke design was that it worked with the natural landscape instead of fighting against it. The western section ended in marshes that Danish engineers could flood by opening sluice gates, turning solid ground into impassable wetlands. The eastern section connected to the Schlei Inlet, a narrow body of water that could be blocked by naval forces. Any army trying to bypass the Danevirke would have to either march through flooded marshlands or bring ships to cross the Schlei while under attack from Danish longships. Archaeological evidence shows that the Danevirke was not just a wall, it was a logistics hub. Behind the main rampart, Danish engineers built roads, storage depots, barracks, and workshops that could support thousands of defenders during long campaigns. There were even designated areas for blacksmiths to repair weapons and for bakers to provide bread for the garrison. This was not a desperate last-ditch defense. It was a carefully planned system designed to support extended military operations. Local communities throughout Scandinavia built their own versions of these defenses on a smaller scale. Hill forts called borgar in Old Norse dotted the landscape, usually built on high ground that commanded views of surrounding territory. These ranged from simple circular earthworks 25 meters across to elaborate stone-walled fortresses that could house entire villages during emergencies. Most hill forts featured single-entry causeways that wound up the hillside between multiple defensive walls. Attackers had to advance uphill in single file, while defenders rained missiles down from above. The gate passages were deliberately narrow, usually only wide enough for one ox cart at a time, making it almost impossible for enemy forces to rush through in large numbers. Archaeologists have found evidence that these hill forts were stocked with supplies each spring as raiding season approached. At Sandby Borg, on the island of Åland, excavations revealed stockpiles of weapons, grain, and tools that suggest local families brought their most valuable possessions to the fort when danger threatened. This was not a permanent garrison. It was a seasonal refuge system that let farming communities continue their normal lives while maintaining a secure fallback position. If you are enjoying raiding the past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more journeys into Midgard living. The Vikings' naval defense system was even more sophisticated than their land fortifications. The levies, or ship levy, was a legal obligation that required every landowner above a certain wealth level to contribute either personal service or money to maintain a coastal defense fleet. Each district had to outfit a longship with about 32 oarsmen plus provisions for 2 months of campaigning. The levies was not just a military draft, it was a complete logistics system. Norwegian law texts from the 1200s, based on much earlier Viking Age practices, spell out exactly what each district had to provide: sailcloth made from walrus hide or wool, ration barrels, spare planks for repairs, and weapon stands for the crew's equipment. If the king lit signal fires or sent out the war arrow, every district had to have their ship ready to sail within 5 days. This system meant that Viking kings could put hundreds of ships to sea within a week of deciding to launch a campaign. but it also meant that hundreds of ships were available for coastal defense. Whenever enemy fleets appeared, the Leidanger ships could patrol offshore waters, intercept raiders before they reached the coast, or blockade enemy fleets in harbors and fjords. Archaeological evidence from the Skoldelev ship finds shows that some Viking vessels were specifically designed for patrol duties rather than long-distance raiding. These ships had wider hulls for stability in rough seas, and smaller crews for extended patrols. They were the Coast Guard cutters of the Viking Age, fast enough to catch raiders, but sturdy enough to operate in all weather conditions. The Vikings also developed sophisticated techniques for blocking harbors and straits. They would sink ships loaded with stones across narrow channels, or drive oak stakes into harbor bottoms to create underwater barriers that could rip the hulls out of enemy vessels. A boom made from lashed logs and dated to 1020 AD was recovered from Roskilde Fjord, providing direct evidence that Vikings used these blocking techniques to control access to important waterways. These naval barriers were not just passive obstacles. They were integrated into larger defensive systems. The stake barriers were positioned to channel enemy ships into killing zones, where archers on shore could shoot down at them. The underwater obstacles were placed at irregular intervals to prevent enemy engineers from quickly cutting through them. Some barriers included hinged sections that could be opened to let friendly ships pass while keeping enemies out. Early warning was crucial to making all these defenses work effectively. The Vikings developed beacon networks that could relay alarm signals across hundreds of kilometers in just a few hours. A royal charter from 955 AD mentions watchfires extending from Scania in southern Sweden east to the island of Öland, suggesting that these beacon chains were organized and maintained by royal government rather than just local communities. Recent archaeological research has used laser scanning technology to map potential beacon sites across southern Scandinavia. The 2024 Viking Beacons Research Project identified 41 probable signal hills between western Norway and eastern Sweden. Experimental archaeology shows that a tar-soaked pine fire on a 60-meter hill can be seen from 40 kilometers away on a clear night, meaning that danger signals could cross the Skagerrak Strait between Norway and Denmark in under 2 hours. The beacon system had built-in redundancy for bad weather. When fog or rain made visual signals impossible, the Vikings used horn calls and messenger riders carrying the war arrow to spread alarms. Viking laws required cow horn blasts at specific intervals, and the sound would echo along narrow valleys and fjords to reach communities that could not see the beacon fires. A carved war arrow from the trading center of Kaupang, dated to about 850 AD, bears notches that probably indicated which direction the threat was coming from and where reinforcements should gather. This was not just a simple alarm system, it was a sophisticated communication network that could coordinate defensive responses across vast distances. The Vikings understood that effective defense required more than just walls and ships. It required trained manpower that could respond quickly to threats. They organized their military forces into several different categories, each with specific roles and responsibilities. At the top were the household warriors, professional soldiers who lived in the halls of kings and major chieftains. These men were housed in barrack-style buildings, fed from royal kitchens, and equipped with the best weapons and armor available. Archaeological evidence from the Jelling complex in Denmark shows barracks buildings with bunks for 40 to 60 men, suggesting that royal households maintained standing forces of several hundred professional warriors. The circular barracks at Trelleborg contained iron helmet rivets and chainmail fragments, proving that these garrison troops were equipped for close combat fighting rather than just ceremonial duties. These were the special forces of the Viking Age, trained in coordinated tactics and available for immediate deployment wherever threats appeared. Below the elite household, warriors were seasonal militias made up of ordinary farmers who served for limited periods during the campaigning season. Norwegian law required these militia members to bring their own weapons and equipment, but it also provided fines for anyone who missed required service. The penalty was 3 ounces of silver per missed muster, steep enough to ensure compliance, but flexible enough to allow essential farm work to continue. The militia system was designed around the agricultural calendar. The busiest farming season was June and July, exactly when most pirate raids occurred because of good sailing weather. Viking communities solved this problem by having brothers or neighbors take turns at military service, so that some men could harvest crops while others manned the ships and fortifications. Viking kings also hired foreign mercenaries to fill gaps in their defensive forces. Recent analysis of teeth from Harold Bluetooth's ring forts shows that many warriors grew up around the lower Vistula River in modern Poland, confirming saga accounts that Danish kings recruited Slavic fighters. This diversity let Viking commanders field specialized troops like Gotland archers or Wendish heavy infantry, depending on what kinds of enemies they expected to face. The weapons and armor used by Viking defenders were adapted specifically for the kinds of fighting they expected to encounter. Round shields 80 to 95 centimeters wide could protect most of a man's torso while leaving his weapon arm free. Battle damage on shields found at Trelleborg shows that the edges were trimmed to interlock with neighboring shields, creating the famous shield wall formation that made Viking infantry so effective. The shield wall, called Skjaldborg or Shield Fort in Old Norse, was not the rigid formation that movies usually show. It was a flexible defensive system where round wooden shields overlapped to create continuous protection while allowing individual warriors to thrust spears or swing axes through gaps in the line. Archaeological evidence shows that these shields were brightly painted in different colors and patterns, probably to help warriors identify their units in the confusion of battle. Chainmail shirts made from thousands of interlocked iron rings provided excellent protection against cutting weapons, but they were expensive and time-consuming to make. Most Viking warriors probably wore leather armor reinforced with metal strips, or thick wool garments that could stop arrows and reduce sword cuts. A few wealthy warriors may have experimented with lamellar armor, small metal plates laced together with leather cords, which was more effective against arrows than traditional mail. The only complete Viking helmet ever found comes from Geirmundbu in Norway, dated to about 975 AD. It has a distinctive spectacle-shaped face guard that deflects downward sword blows, exactly the kind of protection needed when fighting on ramparts or in narrow gate passages. Most Viking helmets were probably simpler iron caps with nose guards, practical protection that worked without interfering with vision or hearing. For siege warfare, Viking defenders used weapons adapted from hunting and farming tools. Crossbow-like springalds shot large arrows over palisade walls. Clay firepots were lobbed from covered galleries to set enemy siege equipment ablaze. Sharpened stakes were dropped from ramparts to puncture ships or impale attackers trying to climb walls. At Firkat, archaeologists found hundreds of clay bullets 3 to 4 centimeters wide that were probably ammunition for slings, cheap and effective weapons that could be used by anyone with minimal training. The legal framework that supported Viking defense was as sophisticated as the military hardware. Laws required every free household to maintain specific weapons and equipment. Icelandic law obligated every farmer to keep a spear, axe, shield, and bow, with fines of 3 ounces of silver for non-compliance. Danish law specified how many wooden planks each farm had to contribute for stockade repairs, with the requirement based on the amount of land owned. These laws made defense a civic duty, rather than just a royal responsibility. If signal fires were lit and a man delayed responding for more than 3 days, neighbors could seize his property to help fund the war effort. This created powerful incentives for communities to maintain their defensive preparations and respond quickly to threats. The Vikings also developed economic systems to support their defensive infrastructure. Merchants and trading centers like Birka and Hedeby paid customs tolls that were specifically earmarked for rampart maintenance and garrison wages. Communities maintained emergency grain stores that could provide seed for replanting if farms were burned during raids. These economic safety nets helped ensure that defensive preparations could continue even after military disasters. Viking defense was not just about walls and weapons. It included psychological and spiritual elements that helped maintain morale during long sieges or periods of threat. Archaeologists found a bronze Thor's hammer amulet nailed to the east gate post at Firkat, suggesting that ritual protection was considered as important as physical fortifications. Sagas describe cursing poles erected facing enemy territories, symbolic projections of defense that worked on supernatural as well as practical levels. The Vikings were also skilled at using diplomacy to reduce military threats. Not all enemies were defeated by force. Many were neutralized through tribute payments, marriage alliances, or negotiated settlements. King Ethelred of England's payments to Danish fleets between 991 and 1012 AD not only bought peace for England, they also reduced pressure on Danish homelands by giving Danish warriors profitable alternatives to raiding their neighbors. Royal marriages created buffer zones that reduced the need for military action. When Harold Bluetooth's daughter married a Saxon duke, it created a diplomatic barrier on Denmark's southern border that was more effective than additional fortifications. These marriage alliances worked because they gave both sides incentives to maintain peace rather than just temporary truces. Fortified trading centers like Hedeby served as diplomatic hubs where representatives from different kingdoms could meet and negotiate. Because these centers hosted merchants from across Europe, attacking them risked angering multiple powers at once. The threat of economic retaliation was often enough to deter military action, making trade centers effective diplomatic shields for the territories they served. The Vikings' overseas colonies used similar defensive strategies adapted to local conditions. When Norse fleets first captured Dublin around 841 AD, they created a ship fort called a long fort, a riverside enclosure where long ships could be hauled ashore behind earthen ramparts. As the settlement grew, it acquired landward ditches and alliances with local Irish kings, turning a raiders' base into a fortified city that protected the Norse settlers from other Irish kingdoms. The Dublin model was copied across the Viking world, from York in northern England to Kiev in Eastern Europe. These fortified trading posts served as both military bases and diplomatic centers, projecting Viking power while also providing secure havens for merchants and settlers. The key was combining military strength with economic incentives, making the Viking presence profitable for local rulers while maintaining the ability to fight if negotiations failed. Archaeological evidence shows how these defensive systems actually worked in practice. At Trelleborg, an oak post from the east gate bears axe marks overlaid with resin splatters, suggesting that the post was damaged in an attack and then quickly repaired with pine tar. Tree ring dating connects this damage to a recorded rebellion by a Viking chieftain named Styrbjorn the Strong around 980 AD, proving that the ring fort's defenders successfully repelled an assault. The siege of Hedeby in 808 AD provides another example of Viking defensive thinking in action. When Charlemagne's Frankish army approached the trading center, King Godfred evacuated the merchants and burned the town, rather than let it fall into enemy hands. This scorched earth strategy denied the Franks a foothold in Danish territory, and within 20 years, Hedeby was rebuilt with stronger defenses. Archaeological evidence of burned layers containing melted glass and carbonized grain matches the historical accounts of this strategic destruction. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 AD is famous for the death of Irish King Brian Boru, but it also demonstrates how Viking fortifications protected overseas settlements. After the battle, Dublin's walls withstood attacks from Irish looters. The Annals of Ulster mention that Norwegians and Danes closed the gates and shot arrows from the battlements, showing that even overseas colonies maintained Scandinavian defensive traditions. Viking defensive systems evolved to include broader segments of society than just adult male warriors. Recent analysis of a grave at Birka, designated BJ581, shows that it contains a woman, buried with full warrior equipment, including sword, axe, and strategic gaming pieces. While such warrior women were probably exceptional, sagas mention shield maidens like Freydis Eriksdottir, who participated in defense of remote settlements when men were away on trading or raiding expeditions. Older men and teenagers played crucial roles in the beacon and communication networks, freeing prime-age warriors for mobile reserves and assault troops. Laws exempted men over 60 from ship service, but still required them to maintain weapons for homestead defense. This distributed approach ensured that every demographic group contributed to community defense according to their physical abilities and social roles. By the middle of the 11th century, the Viking defensive system was evolving toward the feudal models that would dominate medieval Europe. The Christianization of Scandinavia led to the construction of stone churches that doubled as refuges, with thick walls and bell towers that could serve as watchtowers and signal stations. The cruciform floor plans of these churches allowed archer positions at multiple angles, making them effective defensive strongpoints. Royal consolidation under kings like Knut the Great shifted defense from tribute-financed war bands to tax-funded standing armies. The traditional ledanger ship levy persisted, but was increasingly commuted to money payments rather than personal service. Norman castle-building techniques introduced motte and bailey designs into former Viking territories, with Oslo receiving its first stone keep around 1100 AD. The popular image of Vikings as purely aggressive raiders obscures the sophisticated defensive culture that allowed Scandinavian communities to survive and thrive for centuries. From the massive Danevirke earthwork stretching across Jutland to the flicker of beacon fires on Norwegian headlands, Viking defense was a complex system that combined engineering, organization, law, and diplomacy. The royal ring forts projected state power, but they only worked as part of a larger network that included naval patrols, local militias, early warning systems, and economic policies that funded defensive preparations. Diplomacy and tribute bought crucial time for military preparations, while legal codes integrated martial readiness into daily life for every free farmer and craftsman. Modern archaeology continues to reveal new details about how this system actually worked. The 2024 discoveries of underwater stake barriers in southern Sweden and isotope analysis of garrison troops at Trelleborg show that Vikings were early adopters of international military cooperation and landscape engineering. Their success came from recognizing that in a world of fast ships and shifting alliances, survival required both strong fortifications and the flexibility to respond quickly to unexpected threats. So the next time you hear about Viking raiders terrorizing medieval Europe, remember that back home in Scandinavia, other Vikings were developing some of the most advanced defensive systems of their time. They were not just warriors, they were engineers, diplomats, and community organizers who understood that true security comes not from the ability to attack others, but from the wisdom to protect what matters most. Drop a like and pillage that subscribe button if you want to join our band and become a Viking of the Midgard living.